Morning, everybody. Welcome to our latest issue of our spirituality series. Come on down. Great. Well, thank you all for coming. Today our speaker is Mark Peters, who's the director of the Justice and Peace Office for the Priests of the Sacred Heart. Here, he works up on the hill by the Provincialate. He's been with the SEJs about 5 years, and prior to that he had worked for various parishes and with the Archdiocese in similar kinds of positions. So we're really lucky to have him here and glad that he's here. So he's going to talk today about justice and peace and the Priests of the Sacred Heart. So thank you, Mark.
Thanks, everybody. Thank you for coming. I took as my starting point the SCJ, the Priests of the Sacred Heart, Rule of Life number 32 out of their constitution. So, you know, at the heart of what they believe they are as a Roman Catholic congregation, this is part of it. Following the founder, Father Leo Dehon, according to the signs of the times and in communion with the life of the Church, we want to contribute to establishing the reign of justice and Christian charity in the world. So what I want to talk about today in the little bit of time I've got is what is social justice in the first place, because I think there's a lot of misunderstandings about it, even among church people. And what does it have to do with Father Dehon and the Priests of the Sacred Heart, and what are they doing with it today? Yeah.
Speak slowly, please.
Oh, I'm sorry. Sure.
Sorry.
Yes. Good. Okay. Thank you. And just if I'm going too fast again, just raise your hand and I'll slow down. Thank you. So, what is social justice is kind of a tricky question, because if you were born and raised in the United States of America, I don't know about other countries, you're going to have certain ideas, certain stereotypes about what social justice is. Because what do we think of as social justice? We think of social justice activists out protesting for various issues, okay? They may or may not be Catholic, they may or may not be Christian, they may or may not be religious, but they're out there working for social justice or justice and peace. Is that what the church means by justice and peace? Is that what Jesus meant by justice and peace? I think those are the real questions. So just starting with Jesus, in fact, you can't really start with Jesus. You have to start with the Old Testament, because that was Jesus's Bible, okay? And he was steeped in the Old Testament prophets. And unless you understand what Isaiah and Jeremiah and Amos and Hosea and Micah and these folks were talking about, you can't really understand Jesus's concept of what social justice was. And we could do probably a semester-long course just on that question. But the bottom line answer to the question is, it has to do with right relationships. And this is very different from an American idea of justice, and I'll bet other people's ideas of justice too. I'll bet you that most people's idea of justice either has to do with basic fairness, or law and order, or vengeance, okay? Go on Netflix and look up justice movies. You know, what you're going to find is people, you know, shooting it up, you know, to get justice. You know, that's American justice, you know. So I think even for Catholics, American Catholics at least, if we grew up with that understanding of justice, some of those ideas, well, if it's not fair, then I have a right to, you know, use violence to get it or whatever, that's justice. That's not the prophet's idea of justice at all. It's about, first of all, a right relationship with God, who's in charge of my life, basically, who I give lordship to, and also then in right relationship with all of God's creatures and all of God's creation. And nobody certainly more than those people who are in special covenant with God, be it the Old Covenant or the New Covenant. If we're members of that covenant and we believe in the same God and we're in right relationship with that God, then by God we ought to be in good relationship with each other. And that's what the Old Testament standard of justice is, okay? Realizing that Jesus is steeped in that, you know, we can just say any number of things about Jesus' understanding of it. And I'm going to talk a lot about how it's not how many social justice activists think of it today, but in so doing, I'm not denigrating that work. In fact, in many ways, I think it can be connected, but we have to understand as Catholics how and in what ways it can. One of the biggest things about Jesus was he cared for the marginalized, the oppressed, the poor in body and spirit. Does that make him a liberal Democrat? Again, I'm talking U.S. Catholics here. You know, sounds like it, right? But it doesn't. Not any more than, say, his defense of marriage when they tried to stone the woman accused of adultery makes him a conservative Republican. Those labels, those political ideologies didn't exist in Jesus' day. And there was no democratic republic like the United States, you know, context in which he was living. So it's all very different. But, you know, so on the one hand, the Sermon on the Mount didn't say the government should take care of the poor, which is kind of a liberal idea about social justice. But he did say, don't take an eye for an eye, turn the other cheek, and that those who live by the sword will die by the sword. Pretty countercultural today, right? You'd get kicked out of the Democratic Party for talking that way today, let alone the Republican Party. So my point is, social justice today in the United States seems to be a constant battle between the left and the right. The left and the right. And that doesn't help from the standpoint of our Catholic faith. From our Catholic faith is what does it mean in terms of Jesus? I think Jesus' primary concern, and your teachers, you know, can affirm or dispute this, but I think it was preaching the good news. And what was the good news? The kingdom of God. And what was the kingdom of God? Well, it's already here in some way. It's begun to sprout. It's begun to take seed, but it's not yet either. It's certainly not fully here. And how does it get here? By everybody doing what I was talking about before, turning your life over to God, by giving God lordship of your life. That's how justice and peace was going to happen. Simple as that. You know, so Jesus didn't do a lot of things. He did reach out and often cure anyone who came to him or who he came across who was in need, who was infirm in body or spirit. But he didn't spend all his time searching them out. He wasn't a social worker or just a do-gooder that way. You know, he spent his time preaching the good news. He had a message he wanted to get out, that he was on fire to get out. And he didn't talk about justice and peace the way we talk about it today. Okay, so you got to understand that. But that challenges both the left and the right, because each side wants to co-opt him for their own. And each side can find things Jesus said that seems to bolster their side of the argument. But then they use that to say, well, therefore, the other side is completely all wrong. And the truth is that there is no political ideology, and not just Democrat or Republican, socialist, libertarian, Green Party, whatever you want to call it, they all come up short against this vision. So the history of the church since then is building on this. You know, you had church fathers like Ambrose and John Chrysostom and Augustine who preached a lot about the scandal of poverty when so many others had more than they needed, who talked about just versus unjust war in ways that, again, are still considered radical by a lot of people today. Early popes gave great import to this. Pope Gregory the Great allotted a ration of food from his own table for the poor of Rome and ate with 12 of them each day. He obviously saw it as part of his mission. He told the Roman emperor that it was part of his mission too, that unlike the barbarian nations, in all your acts, your first object should be the maintenance of justice. Your second, to preserve a perfect liberty. Then you had Thomas Aquinas in the Middle Ages advancing our understanding of social justice, peace, and the common good. And then jump way ahead to 1891. Pope Leo XIII. In the throes of the Industrial Revolution, this Pope comes out a conservative pope by today's standards, comes out with this huge encyclical, high-level church teaching that labor has dignity, rights that cannot be trampled upon, and they are being trampled upon, and they have the right to just wages, they have a right to organize, all those things. This was like a bomb going off. This was the first instance of modern day Catholic social teaching, but I want you to understand that it all built on what came before, and it ultimately goes back to Jesus, and it ultimately goes back to those prophets. But at the same time, it's constantly being developed because the world is changing, and our understanding is changing. And so now, by the time you're getting to Vatican II and so forth, you're starting to hear the justice and peace vocabulary start to coincide more and more with the vocabulary of other people who are working for justice and peace in the modern world today. Remember, Jesus didn't have nuclear weapons. Jesus didn't have a welfare state. There's so many things that we deal with in terms of social issues today that just weren't there in Jesus' time. So you can't say, well, what would Jesus have said or what would Jesus have done? We can't be sure. All we can do is take the basic principles of love your neighbor as yourself. And not only your neighbor, but everyone is your neighbor. Even the stranger is your neighbor. What does that, just that idea, what does that have to do with today's whole immigration debate, for example? It has huge implications if you take it seriously, if you take it literally. So I just want to finish up by talking about Father Dehon. I could have said more about other statements the church has made over the years that talk about just how much social justice is at the heart of the gospel, is at the heart of what it means to be a Christian. The priest of the Sacred Heart, Father Dehon, met with Pope Leo soon after he issued his encyclical. And Leo said to him, preach my encyclical. And for the next 20 years, that's exactly what Father Dehon did. And he had already been involved with labor and students. He was kind of a community organizer, and you probably have heard some of the other stories of, telling his priests, get out of the rectories, get out of the sacristies, go to the people, serve the people. And he didn't just do charity. He addressed systemic causes too. He was a big defender, a big anti-socialist, but he was also a critic of capitalism, which is usually what Catholic social teaching has done up to the present day. So Father Dehon took that as a huge part of the Dehonian charism. And how is that lived out today? They just asked me to say a couple words about that, and then I'll see if anybody has any questions or discussion. Few things. Immigration has been our big issue over the last number of years, and we started out by trying to educate our own people, by getting them to share their stories of many of them, their immigrant backgrounds and so forth, helping them to see just how imperfect our current immigration system is, by bringing in people to tell stories of being undocumented and so forth, and seeing that angle of the story. The whole global refugee crisis as that has come about. And then we're starting to see intersectionalities, where all of a sudden, climate change, Laudato Si. A few years ago, the Pope said, kind of like Leo saying, preach my encyclical, the Pope said, start caring about climate change. It's going to be too late pretty soon, And now we're starting to see that climate change is driving a lot of the global migration crisis. So these things all begin to intersect. So the priests of the Sacred Heart are involved in that, but really mostly, and for all their U.S. History here in this country, they've been involved primarily by going to where the poorest of the poor are. If you go to that Indian reservation that they serve in South Dakota, you're going to one of the poorest places in the country. If you go to northern Mississippi, where they serve just south of Memphis, there you're going to some of the poorest counties in the country. If you go to Our Lady of Guadalupe Parish in Houston, you're going to a parish that is made up of almost all Hispanics, and probably half of whom are undocumented and are currently, literally in fear for their lives. So they're there. They've gotten out of the sacristies, and they are out there working with people. I think, like all religious groups today, we struggle sometimes with knowing what to do, how to do it, how far to go on the whole social justice element. You know, to what extent do we challenge and resist government policies that we see as clearly immoral? You know, especially when so doing in the pulpit, for example, can cost you big time. You know? So those are the kind of issues that we and other Catholics are grappling with this too. So that, just in a nutshell, is the Priest of the Sacred Heart and Catholic social teaching. And if you have any questions or comments or anything.
A comment or two on you were talking about how the Rerum Novarum was not new, that it was, I mean, it was new in some sense, but
Right.
it was building upon what came before. I read an article once, and I don't know the truth of this, but I just read the article, just reporting it, that Pope Leo's encyclical Aeterni Patris on St. Thomas in 1879 was a necessary groundwork for Rerum Novarum in 1891. In fact, for Pope Leo, there was a strong connection between those two.
Whose was this?
Whose article?
Yeah, no. The document that you're referring to.
1879, Pope Leo.
It was also Pope Leo.
Yeah.
Okay, I don't think I'm even familiar with that document, but
Yeah, I think
I'm not surprised that he
I think
worked
it was
his way.
first encyclical.
Yeah, I'm not surprised that the encyclical wasn't the first time he'd ever thought about it.
Yeah.
You know, but it certainly was the first time it had been put at that level
And then-
of church teaching.
And then for Pope Francis, Let Out to Sea, built upon some of the very strong statements by Pope
Oh, yeah.
Benedict
Yeah.
on environmental
Yeah.
issues.
Catholic social teaching, I don't think that you get a tremendous amount of time on that here. There's certainly, I mean, there's over 120 years worth of documents just on modern day teaching. If you want to go back to the patristics and the Gospels and study, you know, I mean, you could spend a lifetime studying this stuff. So I encourage you as future priests to try to become more familiar with it. There's, you know, nowadays with the web and so forth, there's so much stuff at your fingertips, and you got to be careful. Not all of it is equally good or whatever. But one thing I suggest to you is, if you want to check out our own SCJ social justice website, it's www.dehoniansocialjustice.org, and I've got sections in there on Catholic social teaching, scriptural background, you know, that go into a lot more detail, various issues, what we're doing. There's even an action page in there that's updated at least once a month. Simple, easy, usually 1-minute actions that you can take, emails to congressmen on particular issues, or phone scripts if you care to take it to the next step or something like that. So there's a wealth of resources there for you.
I have one question and one comment. The first question, do you think that total separation between the church and the state, between the church and the politics, would help to contribute to better social justice? That is my first question.
Okay.
Because Leo Dehon, at his time, he defended openly and publicly. He went against the monarchists, and he chose the republic system, and he stated it in open and public discussion. And what do you think about this? Second, comments. From daily meetings with seminarians, I'm a bit disappointed that they talk more about liturgy than social justice things. I would not make any judgment on it, but
I will.
yeah, it's better than you because you're. But I think we have to reflect together on this matter, because I saw some important persons here, teachers, faculties. I think we have to talk more about social justice as well as the liturgy. It concerns me because people always talk about how to move like this or like that,
Yeah.
how centimeters, and
Yeah.
it's awful for me. because we don't talk about the DACA victims lately, or something about immigrants. It's the second time.